I'd like to hand it over to Hayden to introduce our panelists.
We have a really great group of panelists this morning, ranging from M4s to program directors, starting off with David Gibbs, an M4 from Texas, that's currently in medical school at Ohio State and recently matched at Baylor. Next, we have Zach Beer, an OMS4 at the DeBuss College of Osteopathic Medicine, who recently matched at Rutgers Health/Jersey City Medical Center. We have three awesome residents on the panel, starting with Cassidy Shields, the PGY1 at UT Austin, who graduated from UC San Diego School of Medicine, and Gabriel Brandner, a PGY1 at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, who graduated from the Medical University of South Carolina. Finally, we have Tyler Williamson, a PGY1 at UT Health Science Center at San Antonio, who graduated from the University of Incarnate Word School of Osteopathic Medicine. Last but definitely not least, we have the wonderful Dr. Don Laporte, who is a professor and current program director at Johns Hopkins. We really can't wait to hear from all of our awesome panelists. As for the format of this panel, each question is going to be directed to 1 to 2 panelists, but all panelists feel free to jump in at any point. Akshar is going to start with our first question.
Awesome. Thanks, Hayden. So to Gabriel and David, how many aways did you do, and how did you choose which programs to rotate at? Gabriel, let's start with you.
Yeah. So I rotated at 3 away programs. I think there's really like 2 schools of thought, when selecting away rotations. One being, you can apply to, I guess what you would call like stretch schools or very top prestigious programs. I fell into probably more of a latter category where I was more of a maximalist, where I selected programs on which I thought I was a strong candidate at. I think, uh, something I wish I utilized more is alumni network. And I think when you're selecting away rotations, finding people that could be advocates for you when you're at that away and when they're, making their rank list is a huge aspect of selecting away rotations. If I'm, kind of reviewing how my aways went. So I did an away rotation at Vermont, University Medical Center of Vermont. I did a rotation at Brooklyn and a rotation at Loyola in Chicago. So I went to medical school in South Carolina, so that's really outside the geographic reach of South Carolina, but I think there's pros and cons. We had a really large class applying into orthopedics that year, so I went out the geographic, southeast location, and I thought that was very beneficial for me. I think it definitely demonstrated I was interested in and willing to move outside the southeast to go for residency.
David, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I guess the advice I was given is like rotate at places that you want to match, which sounds so simple, but that's definitely great advice to follow. And so kind of to that end, I tried to pick institutions that I thought I wanted to be at for 5 years. And so part of that equation for me was geography. I have a wife and a kid, so I picked a couple places that had really good family support. But kind of secondary to that, I also tried to pick a variety of institutions so I could see if I liked a place that was more like a trauma-heavy institution, like historically. And then I also rotated at more of like a community program just to kind of see what that was like, because I didn't really see that as a third-year medical student. And so I kind of tried to diversify my aways a little bit. And I guess to touch on the first part, I did 4 away rotations, which is a lot. So I got kind of conflicting advice from some of my mentors. A few of them had said, do as many aways as you can. That's going to increase your odds of matching, which I think is true to a certain extent. But I also think there's a point where, doing 4 aways is a really big commitment, and it might not, it might have diminishing returns. So I think kind of that 3 aways is a pretty sweet spot to be in as far as like the number that I'd probably recommend in hindsight. But I did 4 aways. I did 3 of them in Texas, 1 of them in Georgia. Having been a medical student in the Midwest, I was kind of looking to break into a different geographic region, and I was also interested in those programs. So that's kind of how I made my choices.
I think that's good advice. I feel like we all have an idea of what we think we like and want to do, but you don't really know until you're there and experiencing it. Our next question is going to be to Zach and Cassidy. How did you prepare for away rotations, and what are some high yield things students should know? or your favorite things that you use and resources. Zach, we're going to start with you.
Yeah, so I think about a week or so between finishing boards and starting my first audition rotation. So I tried to start a little bit earlier, reviewing materials. So probably around April, I started reviewing my anatomy, which I felt is probably where I got a majority of my questions early on in my away rotations is about anatomy. So I use Netter's anatomy for that. I'm also a big Anki fan, so found a pre-made Netter's ortho Anki deck. So that was really, really good for me. And then I also just tried to read as many x-rays as possible, because we got a lot of questions, asking about fractures, fracture types, fracture classification, and stuff like that. So I'd probably say anatomy and fracture classifications were probably the most asked things early on, like the first couple of weeks of my away rotation. But as you progress in your knowledge, things get a little bit more difficult. But I think starting with anatomy is the most important.
Yeah, I agree totally with what Zach said. I think I mostly prepared through my home rotations in third and fourth year. This is where I really learned how to read x-rays and learned that I needed way more practice reading x-rays. I learned how to be helpful on call and what residents expect out of medical students and how to be helpful. I think high yield things that students should know are things like how to read an x-ray, or at least attempt reading x-rays like succinctly and almost algorithmically. How to be helpful on call, like rolling out splints or where consent forms are, or how to write good notes for your residents. Also preparing for cases, know why the patient's going to surgery, read about the approach, and then what anatomy you may be exposed to during that surgery, like David or Zach was saying. I think high yield resources that I really liked were things like radiopedia.org. It has some quizzes to practice reading x-rays I thought was really helpful. Ortho Bullets is like my Bible. It's the #1 resource, quick bulleted information that you should know about fractures or injury patterns. And then I use the AO Foundation, the surgery reference, I think it's called, for reading about surgical approaches. And that really gives you like important anatomy details that you're going to be seeing in the surgery, and then also like the pitfalls and what to avoid during each approach, which I felt was really helpful.
Awesome. Thanks a ton for highlighting a lot of these like different great resources that students can access to prepare for rotations. For our next question for Gabriel and Tyler, what are some tangible ways that med students can demonstrate strong work ethic without being overbearing or stepping on other people's toes? Tyler, let's start with you.
You repeat the question right quick?
Yeah, sure. So basically, what are some ways that students can demonstrate having a strong work ethic without being overbearing or stepping on other people's toes?
Yeah, I think it's a big part of it, and it's the way that I approach it, especially as a student, is kind of how I grew up in the South. And when we sat at the dinner table with adults, it was kind of be seen and not be heard kind of thing, but always be listening. That was kind of, I think, how I approached rotations as well, was always be attentive, know what's going on, be thinking about what you can do to be helpful next. So as soon as you hear the phone go off and they start talking about distal radius fracture, I'm already thinking in my head, is this a kid? Is this a lady over 65? Do I need to get cast stuff ready, or is this someone that maybe it's intra-articular and an active worker that we maybe are going to be taking the OR at some point. So get, sugar tongue splint stuff ready. So stuff like that starts formulating in my head as soon as that goes off. And always kind of be working in the background. I think the big things that stand out as a student are, as a resident, I don't expect much out of students, but when stuff is prepared without me asking, I think that's awesome. Versus like the students that brag about knowing stuff or all of this other stuff. Like, talk is great, but really it's all about doing. And I think a big part of that is just kind of really, as a third year medical student, going through the motions, showing up to the trauma bay, helping out on your when you're on psych rotation and you've got afternoons off, showing up to the trauma bay, and just getting stuff ready, getting used to, yeah, just being active and thinking ahead. I would say those are the really the biggest things that help is going above, and really thinking about what can be done next. And trust me, you won't necessarily be acknowledged for the things that you do right, but I promise people are taking notice, even if they're not acknowledging that. So I think that's a big thing is don't expect anything in return. Although I was, there last year, so I definitely remember not being thanked for a lot of that stuff. So I try to make sure that the students know that I appreciate their help. But at the same time, don't expect it and just keep working hard because I promise people are noticing.
Awesome. Thanks a ton, Tyler. And we'd also want to ask Zach the same question.
Yeah, so I agree a lot with what Tyler says. I think one of the biggest thing is if you can anticipate what the resident needs, that's gonna make you look really, really good. And like you said, kind of being seen and not heard is really important. You don't want to be one of these people who's, trying to chat up a storm or trying to, make yourself look better than you are, look better than other people. So I think there's a fine line with, making sure that you're confident but not arrogant when you're on these rotations as well. I think that's really important. But I think just working hard. I mean, I know that's, people say that all the time, but you'll see a big difference. In the students that you work with, work hard. Like Tyler said, don't expect a lot of praise. But it does. People notice, and even though I may not have gotten, a good job, every time I did something at the end of the rotations, talking in my exit interviews, they notice it.
So good answers. It's definitely a fine balance. Our next one is for Dr. Laporte. Can you think of any examples of times a rotating student has impressed you, and what can students do to implement those similar soft skills?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a great session. I think away rotators often focus on fund of knowledge, which of course is important, but it's not the most important thing. So as we're talking about soft skills, orthopedics is a team sport. We really want to see that you're able to integrate with the team and be part of the team. We want to see that you're able to respond to feedback and improve, and that you're teachable. And we want to see that you're truly compassionate, caring physician. So these are all at least equally important. And so some examples, we had an away rotator who consistently would introduce themselves to the OR nurse and the scrub tech and always remember their names. And that's a little thing, but it goes a long way, and made an impact. And maybe, a little bit longer example, we had a patient on service who unfortunately had injected drugs intraarterially and had a few fingers that couldn't be saved. So they were going to need an amputation. We spent a lot of time talking to the patient and explaining why we couldn't save the fingers and functional concerns, but they still were refusing to have the surgery. When we left at the end of the day, the away rotator didn't say anything, but made the decision, took it on themselves to go back and talk to the patient, and sat with the patient for a long time, over half an hour, just listening and hearing what their concerns were, and being reassuring. And the next morning when I came in, the patient wanted to have the surgery, and when we were going to the OR, they asked that the student be there. And I think that speaks volumes to the character of that medical student, to the point that they go above and beyond for a patient. They can develop trust. And they're, a good, compassionate, caring physician. So that was a really standout. And then I guess to being able to respond and improve with feedback, there are a lot of examples of that. But one thing I think, that you can all do if an attending asks you a question and you don't know the answer, which happens all the time and is completely fine. At the end of that day, go home and look up what the answer is. And the next time you see that attending, tell them, thank you for asking about this classification. I didn't know it then, but I read about it, and this is, what I found. So let them know, that you heard it and you did something about it. I think those are things that stand out.
Those are really good. I feel like as students, we always stress about the knowledge and the facts we can learn, but there's so much more to it that's really important. Kind of a follow-up question to that for you. Are there any times that students have underperformed in general from a soft skills standpoint or committed any faux pas? And how can students really avoid these things?
So I think that's equally a great question, because your away rotation is your best chance to get a foot in the door at a program other than your home program, but you can also hurt yourself on your away. And I think soft skills are probably the place where people can hurt themselves the most. So you want to treat everybody well and equally. If you treat the junior residents poorly and only, do the things that your senior residents or your attendings ask you to do, that's a mistake. We had one rotator who was rude to our program coordinator. That's definitely a big mistake. And you don't want to talk poorly about other medical students or other residents or even other programs. So even if one of the residents is, saying something negative about one of their colleagues, you can listen, but don't add to that. Don't chime in. I think those are important to think about. Again, you want to be part of the team, and you want to be somebody that people want to be around. And be nice to everybody and figure out how you can help the team, which I've heard from all of you.
Awesome.
I guess I have one other example that stands out. You want to read the room when you're in the OR. And so like if you're in a big trauma case and there's a lot of bleeding, that's not the time to say, oh, does it always bleed this much? Or, oh, does this case always take this long? And that sounds ridiculous, but we have heard that too. So there are times to be quiet.
Awesome. Thanks again, Dr. Laporte. I think it's also super helpful to hear about what to do, but also what not to do. So it's great to hear like both sides of that coin. For our next question to David and Gabriel, looking back, what is one thing you wish you did differently before or during your sub-Is? Gabriel, let's start with you. Oh, sorry, I was muted there.
Yeah, no worries. I think looking at, more opportunities to engage with the residents outside the hospital is always a thing to look out for. I know at some rotations there's like opportunity to take high school football coverage, because a lot of the time you'll be doing like sub-Is in the fall. That's a great time to get to work with residents outside the hospital. So I wish I had more opportunities to interact with the residents outside the hospital. Granted, most of the time is spent in a hospital, but finding those opportunities are pretty unique and a good way to get a better feel for the program.
Awesome. Thanks a ton. David, do you have any insights to add?
Yeah, kind of like two quick things. One of them is not super profound, but I wasn't super prepared. My very first away, like day one, went into the OR and my attending was super nice, but basically like interviewed me on the spot. And so it was like, what's your favorite book? Tell me about yourself. What are your strengths and weaknesses? And that's like such a easy thing to be prepared for. But I was like, oh, it's a orthopedic sub. I'm gonna like study orthopedics, but should also be prepared because it is a 1 month interview. So that opportunity may present itself. So just kind of know that. And then the other thing, I think I got better at this as I got into my sub-Is, but just learning that you're also evaluating the program. So you want to see if it's a place that you think you fit and you really get along with the residents and you want to be in their shoes in potentially 1 year. And so it's kind of crazy to think because we're all focused on getting into orthopedics, but at some point you will be making a rank list. So knowing kind of what you like and dislike about a program and kind of the things that you observe as a student there is something that I wasn't great about observing throughout my first few sub-Is, but as I kind of got into it, I was able to kind of make note of those things. So that's all I would add.
Awesome. Thanks a ton, David. And to kind of build off of that, I want to ask a question to Cassidy. How can rotating students balance wanting to fit in with their residents/teams without feeling too comfortable? And where should they kind of draw that line?
Yeah, I think sometimes that can be a fine line. For me personally, I always just kind of tried to observe how things worked first, tried to get a vibe of how comfortable people were and how inviting to their conversations they were for me. So if I felt they wanted me to be joining and included in the conversation, I would chat with them. Or if I felt like they're a person that would appreciate playfully joking around, then I would do that. But if I also felt like they're kind of serious or busy or something, you just kind of read what they're vibe is. I think I would draw the line at making yourself stick out in a bad way, like Dr. Laporte was saying. I would definitely avoid, making jokes that could be misconstrued in any way, or avoid complaining about your schedule or how tired you are, or how much work you feel like you're doing or need to do still. In general, just like Dr. Laporte said, just kind of read the room. Residents and attendings really want to get to know you too, but there's like correct times to do that, and more appropriate times, I think, during lunch or between consults, or like Gabriel was saying, outside of the hospital can be a great way to let your personality shine, versus being like overly talkative in the OR or during a trauma, which can kind of can take back from the way people view you. I think just in general, showing enthusiasm and interest about whatever you're doing, whether that's in the OR or helping with consults, is just the perfect way to kind of let your personality shine.
It's good to know, and definitely always reading the room, always. I think that's general theme. This next one's going to be to Zach and Tyler. Can you guys talk more about navigating away rotations as DO students? Did you guys face unique challenges that maybe MD students did not? How did you find DO-friendly programs? We'll start with Zach.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So start off with finding DO-friendly programs. So the AOAO, which is the American Osteopathic Academy of Orthopedics, has a whole list of the traditional DO programs that were part of the old AOAO match before the merger. So that's one way to find it. And I think talking with colleagues as well, either older medical students who have been in your situation or other residents who are DOs, they can give you a good insight of the programs that are DO friendly. And in terms of challenges that I may have faced, unfortunately, there is some inherent bias that's still around. So there are a lot of programs who, may not, be interested in DOs, but I don't think I necessarily faced a true challenge where I was personally looked down upon because of my DO status. I think that is something that's not, really happening as much. I do think that if you show that you are willing to put in the work, that you're knowledgeable, you can, the playing field's level for all of us. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Zach and I talked a lot about his list prior, and I think the only reason for that was I talked with older DO residents as well about my list and kind of where I wanted to rotate, where I thought would be good places. I think reaching out to residents at that program beforehand is definitely the most meaningful, especially if it's a place that hasn't taken a DO or maybe took a DO 4 years ago or something like that. That was the most helpful for me. You can kind of gauge interest based on that. And I felt like that was the most helpful in terms of putting interest in the program and seeing what I got back. What was it reciprocated, or was I just kind of pushed off? There's 200 programs out there. Don't waste your time on a program that's not willing to reciprocate love back to you. If you're second guessing about if this program likes you or not, I'd probably just move on. Just a quick story. It's kind of funny. Program that I'm at right now, hadn't taken a DO, had been told by chiefs that I would rotate with here during my second and third year that they screen out DOs. There's a lot of anti-DO bias. And so I really just didn't put in a lot of effort to match at this program. I did research with some of the attendings. This is the only orthopedic program in the city. So I knew that getting a letter of recommendation would help me everywhere else at those other 199 programs. So really putting in effort and gaining knowledge. The best way to do that was to rotate with the surgeons here. And I just continued to do that without really trying to put a whole lot of interest into the program. But at the same time, I guess that's kind of what I was doing, was just showing up, working hard, and really for my own benefit. And then somehow, I guess, just managed to sway the, really, I think what happened was I went from being a DO student to being Tyler. Like I wasn't necessarily someone that submitting an application from across town. I was somebody that they knew, somebody that they trusted because of how often I was able to rotate here. And so I think that that's kind of the big thing is the more you can get in contact with the program and really familiarize yourself with both residents and faculty. I think that that's, at least for me, was extremely important to overcome any bias or any kind of unknowns. I would really say it's not really bias, it's just a lot of unknowns. When a lot of programs are looking at DO applicants, especially some of these newer DO schools, there's just a lot of unknowns. They don't know how your clinical rotations are associated. There's no, I went to the University of Incarnate Word. We don't have University of Incarnate Word Level 1 Trauma Center. And so they have no idea where I went on rotations. It's hard to gain that from the MSPE. So the only way that you're able to stand out is by, online communication and then hopefully with an away rotation. So really, same way with Zach, I really didn't feel like any of the places that I rotated at, once I got there, I was looked at any differently. So when going into those type of rotations, don't be afraid that, oh, everyone knows I'm a DO. Like especially the residents, like they're not going to ask. And secondly, they probably don't care if you're MD or DO. They just want to see if you work hard and everything. It may matter a little bit once you get to the interview and they start getting into your application. But I think, the big things is continue to work hard and then really just show interest early. So the more that you can familiarize yourself with the programs and they can familiarize themselves with you, can overcome any unknowns about that they may have about your application.
Those are awesome answers and definitely really helpful to a lot of applicants. I have a question from the chat. Looks like Cassidy is maybe typing an answer. But to Cassidy and Dr. Laporte, we can start with Dr. Laporte. As a female applicant, how do you balance being respectful / observant without being perceived as too quiet?
I think that's a good question, and it goes back to what Cassidy was saying before. I mean, you want to be yourself and however you're most comfortable, but always be respectful. But speak when you feel like it's an appropriate conversation. If you have something to add it. You're right. I think female applicants are judged as being quiet more so than maybe male applicants. So find your people. Find where you're comfortable, and then be yourself and let people know, who you are when you're there.
Definitely agreeing with everything Dr. Laporte said. I think when there's an appropriate time for you to be chatting or you to show your personality, then that's the exact time to do so. And just, be respectful other times, but, just be who you are authentically. And that's what people are looking for when you're a sub-I, and that's what they want to appreciate in a future intern and resident.
Awesome. Thanks, Sachin. I think that insight's like super helpful because it's always challenging to kind of like balance like showing your personality versus knowing like when to like kind of be a bit more quiet. And for our next question, I wanted to ask David and Zach, should students obtain a letter of rec from a sub-I or prioritize letters that they might have more meaningful longitudinal relationships with? And how do you ask for a letter of rec on a sub-I? David, we can start with you.
Okay. I guess the answer is yes. I think it's important to have longitudinal letter. I mean, this is my bias, my personal experience. I think it's important to have longitudinal letters, but you're allowed to submit, I think, up to 4 at a lot of institutions. And so I think having someone from a different institution who can speak to your experiences a little bit more unbiased adds strength to your application. I guess the alternative to that is that it could also not add strength. If you don't perform super well and you ask for a letter and then you add that into your application, they don't really have anything invested in your education as much as the people at your home institution. And so it's a little bit riskier, I guess I would say. But I think it's incredibly valuable. And I think a lot of people, at least that I interacted with throughout my OAs, were incredibly, open to that opportunity. And then just to briefly touch on like how to ask for a letter on an OA, I think everyone has a little bit of a different approach to this, but I like tried to make sure it was someone I worked with for at least 2 weeks is kind of how I tried to do it. Because like a lot of my ways, I would do 2 weeks on trauma and then 2 weeks on like a subspecialty service. And so I didn't get any letters from traumatologists because I didn't work with them as frequently. But I got a letter from a subspecialty surgeon that I worked with pretty much every day for 2 weeks. And at about the halfway point, I mentioned that I was interested in getting a letter from him and wanted to ask for feedback, see if there was anything I could focus on in our last week. And so then, at my exit interview with him, after working with him for 2 weeks, we were able to talk about, the feedback he had given me earlier in the week, and then some of the things that went well and some of the things to kind of look forward to. And so, my hope was that that gave us more of a, even though it was only 2 weeks, more of a longitudinal relationship. And so I felt comfortable asking him for a letter. But yeah, I think it's valuable to get a letter from your aways. That's something else you can think about when you're planning when to do your aways. So I did 3 aways in Texas, which is potentially like a red flag if you're like, oh, this guy only wants to go to Texas. But I did it in such a way that I did an away in Georgia, and then I did my rotation in Ohio, and then I did 1 away in Texas. And so by the time I had submitted my application, it was like a little bit of a variety. And so you can consider that as well when you're planning out when to do your aways.
Awesome. Thanks a
Yeah.
ton, David. And Zach, any additional insights?
Yeah, so I agree a lot with what David said. I think, in my opinion, the strength of the letter is the most important thing. So for me personally, 3 of my 4 letters came from the same institution, and 1 came from a separate away rotation. But I had known the people from this one institution for over 8 years because I had interned with them in my undergraduate studies and worked there for 2 years between undergrad and med school. So the strength of those letters were far more important, I feel like, for my application, because they know me way better than someone who would on a 1-month away rotation. So I think you should take that into account as well.
Awesome. It's good to know. There's definitely a lot of conflicting opinions out there, so those answers are really helpful. Our next question is to Dr. Laporte and Cassidy. How can rotating students show interest in a program or develop strong relationships with the attendings there, especially if only a small amount of time is spent with the attendings or you rotate around with a lot of different attendings? Cassidy, we'll start with you.
Sorry, can you repeat just the first part of that?
Yeah, how can rotating students show interest in a program or develop really strong relationships with the attendings at a program, especially if only you're spending a short amount?
Sure. I think honestly, like I loved when medical students would just text me after the rotation and be like, I had a really great time. This is like a top program for me, or I really liked this about the program and I'm really interested in learning more. So I think just like literally letting the program know that you're interested in them is a great way to do that. I think also a lot of times people send follow-up emails to attendings that they worked with and, highlighted the couple cases they did with them or what they really enjoyed about their particular teaching style or work ethic. So I think just being vocal about what you actually liked about the program is the perfect way to do that.
I would completely agree with that, being forthcoming with the attendings as well. I think before you hit the door, being proactive and reaching out to a resident who's there, who's been on the service or who is on the service that you're joining, to find out how the service flows and what the expectations are, shows that interest before you even get there, and even reaching out to the attending on that service to introduce yourself before you get there, and or setting up a Zoom to meet with them. I think is helpful in the sort of proactive sense. And then, while you're there, being engaged and then letting people know. And, at your exit interview is a really nice time to say, yes, I have other rotations, but I really love this program. I really enjoyed X, Y, or Z specifics about it. And I think, people hear that.
Awesome, thank you. And an additional question to Tyler and Gabriel. Looking back, what's one thing that you wish you did differently before or during your sub-advise? Tyler, let's start with you.
Probably slept a little bit more. No, that's not it. Probably studied a little bit more. That kind of depends on your school a little bit. I kind of envy some of the schools where you get to take step 2 a little bit earlier, like in April or May, and then have somewhat of a gap where you can either put, your medicine 4th year selective or something in there where you can kind of study for your away rotations. I was coming off a research year Finished that on July 15th, had to move all of my stuff back to Texas, and then started my first away rotation on like July 20 something. So I had like 2 weeks in there. Didn't get a whole lot of studying done. So kind of like David said, just kind of like showed up to my first rotation, like was just like happy to be there, and then just got to ask questions and got drilled very quickly by pimp questions that I had no idea. And so, yeah, let's just say I learned a lot that rotation, and that's okay. Like I probably wouldn't schedule my number one rotation first. That's probably something looking back, not that I did, but no matter how much you study prior to that first away rotation, hopefully you learn the most during that first away rotation. And I would try to make that first one, if if you have a good mix of like community program versus, workforce trauma program versus more academic, maybe elective surgery, not as much call. I'd probably try to make that first one one where you're like really pushed to study hard, where you're asked a lot of questions. You're gonna look dumb, and it's okay. Like, you're a medical student, you're the dumbest person in the room. I'm a first year intern, I'm still the dumbest person in the room, because there's not any medical students around, and that's okay. Like, so no one's gonna fault you for asking questions. Like, you're supposed to look dumb, but hopefully by week 4 you look a little bit better than you did in week 1. And that was my goal, was to take what I learned each day and then supplement that with either Handbook of Fractures, Ortho Bullets. The AOS Rock curriculum, I think, is really good if you can get access to it as a medical student. It's more a textbook form of Ortho Bullets, whereas Ortho Bullets is more Anki cards. But I think that's the thing, is I wish I could have studied a little bit more. Your curriculum may not allow for that. So really just be prepared to hit the ball running. I would make sure to get step 2 out of the way before I start away rotations, and really just really pound the books during that first away rotation, because getting to that second and third away rotation, if you've already done rotations, they're going to expect you to know some stuff. And if you kind of lackadaisically walk through that first away rotation, it's going to make you look not as good for those second and thirds. So really push yourself during that first away rotation, if you can, before that. But either way, you're going to show up, you're going to get some answers wrong. That's okay. Learn from it, and just continue to find how you learn best during those away rotations.
Yeah, I guess now being on the flip side as an intern, now working with medical students, I think wishing I knew how to be, able to anticipate needs more, now knowing like what an intern needs. The things I would recommend, identifying on all your away rotations versus splint materials. Like, there's so many things going through an intern's head when you get a new consult for a distal, femur open fracture or something of that sort. Your head spinning. So if you can reduce like the mental load on your intern, that is huge. So I would always recommend identifying, splint material. I know this might be institutional specific. If you could help with prepping lists, before you going home at night, ortho is pretty simple. Like, we really just want to know your hemoglobin, your white blood cell count, and what they did with PT the night before. So if you could have those answers prepped for us in the morning, we're going to love you for it. What else? I wish I could have bird dogged the ORs a lot more whenever I did have the opportunity to be in the OR. I think just hanging out with the OR staff and just texting whoever you're working with, hey, patient just rolled back, they're not intubated yet, just so they can kind of time out. There's so many tasks that need to be done on an orthopedic service. So just bird dogging things for your senior, also huge things I wish I knew prior. But I think those things can also help you to stand out.
Just to follow up to that, do y'all have any good resources for students to look at for splints? That's something that I get asked a lot of questions about, and I just tell them, well, you'll kind of learn it as you go. But does anyone have anything that they used prior to sub-Is that helped them like know for a distal radius or short leg, long leg splints, like what materials you need and stuff?
I will say I think Ortho Access has some videos on this, so there's some stuff in the works on this. But those are awesome, really great answers, and super helpful. I think we have maybe 2 minutes, so I'll rapid fire a couple things from the chat. Anyone can answer. Do you guys think it's important for the letter to be a letter of rec to be from an orthopedic surgeon you've worked closely with in the OR? Can it be a longitudinal/research collab?
Yeah, I just tried to answer that in the chat. I would say one longitudinal letter that is non-ortho can be from research is great, but the other letters should ideally be from ortho and somebody you've worked with clinically as well.
Awesome. For someone without a home program, what's the best way to get to know a program? That they're interested in.
Yeah, so for me, when I was going, so I didn't have a home program. So for me, I just really wanted to get to know the residents as much as possible because for me, that was most important to me was having a good community and having a good group of people that I can rely on and be friends with, and somebody that I don't just want to spend time with in the hospital, but also outside of the hospital as well. And then making sure that the city that the program's in is something that I would enjoy and would fit the needs of both myself and my wife, and something that was a place we would enjoy living outside of the hospital.
Okay, awesome. And then just rapid fire, last closing question, anything else that you want to leave us with? Any last wisdom? Anyone can take it away.
I'll start. Somebody did say this, but definitely remember that even though you're there on audition, it's your opportunity to evaluate that program. And if you want to spend 5 years there, so take time to notice that and get that feel. So when you walk away, and then it's come up multiple times, but figure out how you can be helpful when you're there. At the end of the month, you want that team to say, how did we survive, without Cassidy here or whatever. That's what you want to leave them with.
I guess my hot take is, a lot of this orthopedic core knowledge isn't really proprietary. What we're really evaluating on is this going to be a colleague that we can work with for the next 5 to 6 years? So it's those soft skills, it's those intangibles that we're really evaluating. You can read ortho bullets. We can teach you orthopedics. We can teach you how to, drill drills and saw saws, but, we want someone that we want to work with for 5 years.
Yeah, and I'll just say, don't be afraid to ask people about where to rotate and stuff like that. I mean, most residents, in my opinion, will be happy to talk with you about that. And the more people you can talk with, I think the better idea you get of where to rotate. The thing you don't want to do is show up to a place that you could have asked somebody a question about and found out that you didn't want to be there for the next 5 years and then waste 4 weeks on a away rotation. So I just recommend talking with people about your list, figuring out what's a good, kind of thinking about not just where you want to be for the next 5 years, but also where you want to be in 10 years, 15 years, and kind of see how that aligns with the program's mantra. So not just, do I want to be in a nice city, this type of stuff, but do I want to be a community surgeon knocking out level 3 trauma cases and then doing a lot of joints, or do I want to be level 1 ortho onc, really complex limb restoration type stuff, and then kind of seeing how the program is going to help you get there. So don't think about ortho residency being a goal or an end goal. Think of it as getting you to that spot. I mean, it's great to match ortho residency. I love what I do. It's awesome. I don't regret it a single day. But at the end of the day, I did not sign up for this to be the ortho intern handling consults right now. I promise. So one day you're going to be through residency, and I guess just talking about that and thinking about that now can really help you get to where you want to be in 10, 15 years and help you accomplish what's important to you.
Awesome. Thanks a ton, Tyler, and thanks a ton, everyone, for sharing your insights over the last hour and bearing with us with our technical difficulties. I feel like there's a lot of great conversation, a lot of great insights shared. And I want to hand it back to Ryan and Jess to sort of like pivot to our next panel.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much to Hayden, Akshar, and all our panelists. There was a lot of great wisdom there and really appreciate that.